from Anshe Sfard, Bethel Emeth Congregation. It's time to take 10 minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of love and the Omer. We'd like to understand the relationship between loving your neighbor as yourself and the counting of the Omer. Many connections. One is that we're going to be reading the Parshiot of Achrei and Kadoshim during this time. The Parsha of Kadoshim, which contains the verse in chapter 19, verse 18, which says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ani Hashem, I am God. So that's one connection. But then also, we say that this period of the Omer was a period during which the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died during this period. Why? Shelo nagu kavod b'zel hazeh. They did not engage in honoring one another. So the famous question is, what do you mean? Rabbi Akiva was the one who taught the major principle in the Torah is to love your neighbor as yourself. How could his students, who are supposedly students of his, they imbibed his teachings, they didn't give honor one to another? How could it be? So there's a beautiful interpretation that says that they understood that you should love your neighbor as yourself, and that everyone was equal to themselves. What they didn't understand was what the Rambam writes, Maimonides writes regarding loving your neighbor, that yachos al kvodo, you should be very concerned about their honor. There's a difference between love is love. You're just like me, kamocha. You're a pal, I'm a pal, we're all on the same level. Equality. No, we're asking for more than equality. We're asking to give honor to the next person, to treat them as higher than yourself. All the Sfarim say that you should always imagine there's something else you can find in someone else, in every other person, that's better than you. I mean, the biggest so-called bum on the street, you can find something that they have that you don't have. Every human being possesses something that you could learn from. Maybe Kol Adam, who's a wise one who can learn from every person, and there's always something to learn from someone else. There's something you could honor about that person. And in this sense, perhaps Rabbi Akiva was trumped by his friend Ben Azai, who claimed that there's a greater principle, and that is the image of God, that the idea that man is created in the image of God, that's a greater principle than loving your neighbor, because loving your neighbor, you might think, is only as yourself. But the truth is that you should consider him to be image of God. True, you have image of God too, but you should look at the other and say, wow, that person is in the image of God. They can think, they can decide, they can create. I want to honor such a person. But of course, it's not really a trumping, because within Rabbi Akiva's idea itself, there is this idea of honoring others, yachos al kvodo, to be concerned with the honor, not just the love, but the honor of another person as part of the mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein of blessed memory, Zecher Tzadik L'Bracha, who just passed away just recently, he has a beautiful article in the Alon Shvut about loving your neighbor as yourself. And I'd like to share how he analyzes the mitzvah of loving your neighbor, because that's something we need to focus on during this period of the Omer. So there's the idea that loving your neighbor is a klal gadol b'Torah. It's a great principle. What do you mean a great principle? He says you can take that one of two ways, as Rabbi Lichtenstein always looked at things in different ways. He says, well, you could take it as it's one of the great ideas of the Torah, one of the underlying ideas of the Torah. It's a beautiful idea. The idea we should love each other and we should respect each other. And in that sense, it's similar to Ben Azai, who said that we should recognize that everyone has the image of God. However, others, including Rashi on the spot in Masechet Shabbat, on the story of Hillel, and who said that what you hate, you should not do to your neighbor, Rashi says that this principle underlies all of the Torah. It's an underpinning to all the laws of the Torah. For instance, you shouldn't steal. Why? Because we love our neighbor. We shouldn't be jealous. Why? Because I love my neighbor. I shouldn't take revenge. Why? Because I love my neighbor. So it's an underpinning of all of the laws. Now, then there's always the problem of, how can you really love someone else? I mean, as yourself. I mean, you can love someone, but as much as yourself. You should love everyone as much as yourself. This seems like an unrealistic idea, and even the Ramban says it's sort of a hagzama, it's sort of a haflaga, it's sort of a little bit of an exaggeration to think you could do that. But the Ramban points out, and Rabbi Lichtenstein pointed it out from a grammatical, syntactical point of view, that it doesn't say v'havta Et reacha kamocha. You should love your, that would translate, you should love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say that. It's v'havta l'reacha kamocha. It's not the accusative, I believe he says the dative. It's a different form. It's you should love to your neighbor. It's about things you do to your neighbor. It's not about actual love. And therefore, there's the idea that yachos al mamono, yachos al gufo, yachos al kvodo, that you should be concerned with the other person's physical body. They shouldn't have any harm. Their money, you should want, you want to be rich, you should want everyone to be rich. Their honor, as we mentioned, and also yisaper bishvacho, that it's a practical thing. You should praise other people. Spend some time praising your children, praising your wife, praising your neighbor. It creates a community of love and camaraderie. In synagogues, we say, we often talk about, this one is sponsoring the Kiddush, or this one is having a bar mitzvah, and we praise them. And people think, it's false flattery. But actually, you can build community that way by saying, this person is important. The next week, we'll talk about the next person and how important they are. And yisaper bishvachot, to build love in a community by telling the greatness of every single human being. But then there's another thing of loving et, v'havta et. Never says you should love your neighbor. It says you should love to your neighbor. However, there is a realm in which the Torah says v'avtem et. Firstly, of course, with God, you should love God. That's doable. We can love God. But what about the fellow human being, random stranger? Comes to actually the stranger, the ger, the rabbis interpret the convert, the righteous convert. V'avtem et hager. It actually does say you should love the convert. Now, Rabbi Finkelstein, in typical style, says you can look at this in one of three ways. Either that the love of the convert is the same, it's just the same law over again. It's one mitzvah to love all people, and the convert just repeats it. It's the same law. Or that it's double, that, it's not the same law. There are two different laws. There's loving your neighbor and loving your convert. If you love the convert, you get two mitzvahs. And then there's a third way some of the commentators look at it, and that is that it's different. It's fundamentally different from loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is loving to your neighbor. You should be concerned with their money, their property, their honor. But when it comes to the convert, because they came under the wings of God, you should actually love them. But then we run into the problem again. How can you love someone like yourself? It doesn't say you should love your convert like yourself. It says you should love to your convert like yourself. V'havta lo kamocha. But v'havtem et hager doesn't say kamocha. It doesn't say it should be like you. Because if it's indeed that more mushy kind of love, that you can't demand that it's going to be at the same level as you love yourself. Now, the question is, the great Rabbi Akiva and the great Hillel, they seem to say the same thing. Is it really the same thing? Hillel said, you want to know the whole Torah on one foot. What you hate, don't do to your friend. And Hillel and Rabbi Akiva said, loving your neighbor as yourself, this is a great principle. Sounds like the same thing. And in fact, Lichtenstein points out that the word kamocha, like yourself, some of the Aramaic translators say that that's what it means, like yourself, meaning whatever you like, whatever you don't like, that's how you should love your. How do you love your neighbor? Like yourself. Whatever you like, you should do to your neighbor. Whatever you don't like, you should not do to your neighbor. Now, the problem is, Hillel formulates it in the negative, and the Rambam formulates it in the positive. Also, Christians, early Christians, surely having heard Rabbi Akiva's preachings and Hillel's preachings, they also translate it in the positive. And so, for instance, the Rambam talks about visiting the sick, that, you would want someone to visit you, so you should visit them as well. Now, Rabbi Lichtenstein asked a question, which I didn't get to see his answer to it, but it's an interesting question, and that is, some people derive the idea of visiting the sick, comforting those who lost loved ones, they derive that from loving your neighbor as yourself. However, others derive that, as the Gemara in Sota, from the notion of walking in God's ways, being like God, to cling to God. Now, what's the difference if we look at why we visit the sick because we love our neighbor, or visit the sick because we want to walk in God's footsteps? So I think really they're very complementary. On the one hand, there's a certain type of Torah personality that we want to develop. A personality, they should God willing, speak about us in our character the way people spoke about Rav Aaron Lichtenstein and his character. We want to have a sterling character. But on the other, and that's the halach d'abidracha. You should be God-like. God has concern for others. You should also. But then it becomes, almost mercenary. It's like, oh, the reason I'm visiting you is because I want to have a sterling character. Says, yeah, maybe the love is a practical thing. It has to actually relate to actual actions like visiting the sick. But there's an element of actual love here. There has to be some actual love. It's not just, I want to build my character, so I'm coming to visit you. I'm visiting you because in some sense, I do love you. I care about you. And that's why we need both verses to talk about our character, and then our actual hitachzut, our actual relationship with the other person should be one of love, care, and concern. You know that we've mentioned that there are 48 ways in which you can prepare yourself for Torah, and then these are the 48 steps we take before the Shavuos on the 50th day, and the 49th day we review all the other steps. One of the steps is Ohevet Habriot, loving other people. And we can train ourselves to truly have a sense that we want to have the character of God, we want to have the character of the greats who lived before us, we want to have a loving character, and we also want to be possessed with the characteristic of love. Then through this characteristic, we can hopefully take one of those steps to prepare ourselves for Shavuot, to prepare ourselves for receiving of the Torah. Thank you for joining us here for our discussion of the Omer and Love. Join us each week to the discussion of the Parsha and various upcoming holidays. And thanks to Jason Lefkowitz, our producer. Thank you.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein. To learn more, visit ASBEE.org.